Part 1. The Steak Saga begins. Whether the grilling season's upon us or not, steak remains the darling of every meat lover's heart. Why? Nigh on half the folks in these United States, according to the high and mighty National Cattlemen's Beef Association, swear they chew through a slab of steak at least once a week, likely to prove they ain't sheep nibbling grass all day. But when it comes to steak nutrition facts, that juicy red hunk is a two-faced rascal. It hands out health benefits with one hand and sneaks risks in with the other. So pray tell, what's the healthiest steak cut? And how does a man fit this red meat into the healthiest way to eat steak without turning himself into a walking feedlot? Steak, to give it fair due, is a treasure chest of nourishment, brimming with protein enough to make a chicken blush and lay square eggs. Miss Lara Clevenger, a dietitian with more letters after her name than a snake's got rattles, MSH, RDN, CPT, declares it's loaded with healthy fat-soluble vitamins, iron, and vitamin B12. Even them fatty cuts like ribeye deserve a tip of the hat, so long as you don't gobble 'em like the world's ending tomorrow. But here's the rub, friends. Too much of a good thing turns sour. Stuff yourself silly with steak protein content and your innards'll holler for mercy. The American Institute for Cancer Research, a somber bunch, warns us to cap red meat at 18 ounces a week, lest cancer come knocking. So, if you aim to live long and eat well, pick the best lean steak, keep your portions tame, and don't try to swallow the whole herd. To save you from groping in the dark like a fool hunting a needle in a haystack, I've ranked 11 popular cuts, from the lean beef cuts ranked at the top to the worst steak for health you'd best dodge. Stick around for a steak calories comparison and a few chuckles about this meaty affair. And if you're still peckish for wisdom, don't miss 5 healthiest meats to eat, straight from the dietitian's gospel. Part 2. The mightiest of the lean. London Broil now. Let's mosey on to the champion of healthy steak cuts, the London Broil, known to the learned as a top round steak. Here's the tally for a 100-gram slab. 216 calories, a stingy 7 grams of fat, with just 3 grams of that saturated mischief, 45 milligrams of sodium, nary a carbohydrate to its name, and a whopping 36 grams of steak protein content that'd make a buffalo nod in respect. This here's the best lean steak for folks keeping an eye on their waistline. A true knight in shining armor among low-fat steak options. But hold your horses. There's a catch. This cut hails from muscles that have worked harder than a plow, mule in springtime, so it's tougher than a $2 steak left out in the sun. Chew on it raw, and you'll be gnawing till kingdom come. The healthiest way to eat steak like this? Take its name as gospel. Broil it or braise it low and slow, till those stubborn fibers surrender into something tender and juicy. Treat it. Right, and this London Broil will reward you with flavor aplenty, all while keeping your steak calories comparison in the good graces of your conscience. It's proof you don't need a fat-drenched ribeye to live high on the hog. Part 3. The Dandy New York Strip, lean and proud. Next up in our parade of healthy steak cuts struts the New York Strip, a fine gentleman of a steak that don't need no excess baggage to shine. Per 100 grams, or nigh on 3.5 ounces, you're cold, looking at a modest 150 calories, a trifling 6 grams of fat, with 3 grams of that saturated sort, 45 milligrams of sodium, not a speck of carbohydrate to trouble your soul, and a hearty 23 grams of steak protein content to keep your muscles humming. This here's one of the best lean steaks on the butcher's block, and it goes by more aliases than a riverboat gambler. Kansas City steak, hotel-style steak, top loin, or shell steak, depending on who's hollering for it. Now, don't let its slim figure fool you. This cut's got a buttery texture and flavor so full, it could charm the boots off a cowboy, all without piling on the grease. For those hunting low-fat steak options, the New York Strip is a prince among the lean beef cuts ranked, proving you don't need a fat-soaked slab to savor the good life. In a steak calories comparison, it stands tall and trim, letting you eat. Hearty without fretting over your waistband. Why, it's the kind of steak that'd make a health nut tip his hat and a glutton lick his chops. Proof the healthiest way to eat steak don't mean skimping on taste. Part 4. The Humble Hero. Bottom round steak now. Let's tip our hats to the bottom round steak, a sturdy contender in the ring of healthy steak cuts that don't fuss with frills. Weighing in at 100 grams, or your standard 3.5 ounces, this fella clocks 191 calories, a lean 8 grams of fat, with a mere 3 grams of that saturated devilry, 57 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to speak of, and a robust 27.2 grams of steak protein content that'd make a blacksmith's arm jealous. For those chasing low-fat steak options, this cut's a gem, delivering just 14% of your daily saturated fat limit, leaving plenty of room for a slice of pie without guilt. This ain't no tender dandy, mind you. It's a working man's cut, tough as a mule's hindquarters if you don't treat it right. But here's the healthiest way to eat steak like this. Soak it in a good marinade till it's singing hallelujah. Then cook it slow and serve it up family style. Slice off a sensible 3 to 5 ounce portion and you've got a meal that fits square in the lean beef cuts ranked for virtue. In a steak calories comparison, it holds its own without puffing up your britches, making it a fine pick for folks who want flavor without the fat fanfare. Why? Part 5. The fancy filet mignon. Tender as a poet's heart now, let's saunter over to the filet mignon. A cut so refined, it might just curtsy before you take a bite. Per 100 grams, it tallies up 217 calories, 10 grams of fat, with 4 grams of that saturated scoundrel, 58 milligrams of sodium, not a whisper of carbohydrates, and a princely 30 grams of steak protein content that'd make a lion purr. Miss Won Na-chun, a learned soul from One Pot Wellness with a string of titles, MPH, RD, CPT, swears it's a very lean cut of beef, slimmer on fat than them rowdy ribeyes or T-bones. It's a darling among healthy steak cuts, no doubt, and a top pick for the best lean steak brigade. But don't be fooled, this dainty morsel's got a buttery tenderness and juicy swagger that comes from that sneaky 10 grams of fat. It's the kind of trick that keeps it tasty without tipping the scales too far into sin. For those dodging saturated fat like a cat dodges a bath, too much of which, Miss Chun warns, might invite heart trouble, the filet's low-fat steak. Options shine bright. In a steak calories comparison, it struts a fine line between indulgence and virtue, proving the healthiest way to eat steak can still pamper your palate. Why? It's a cut so genteel, you'd think it was raised on sonnets. Instead of grass, and it'll keep your ticker ticking without much fuss. Part 6. The top sirloin. A common man's king next in our cavalcade of healthy steak cuts rides the top sirloin, a cut so versatile it could dance a jig and grill a feast all at once. For a 100-gram serving, it weighs in at 219 calories, 11 grams of fat with 4 grams of that saturated rogue, 58 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to pester your plate, and a stout 29 grams of steak protein content that'd fortify a steamboat captain. This here's a best lean steak that won't empty your wallet, tastes like a dream kissed by fire, and keeps the fat modest enough to call it one of the low-fat steak options worth a cheer. Mind you, the fat tally might shift a smidge depending on how the butcher wields his knife or what breed of beast you snag, but by and large, it's among the tenderest of the lean beef cuts ranked for good health. Grill it up and it sings a song of flavor without drowning you in grease. In a steak calories comparison, it stands proud. Neither too skinny nor too plump, proving the healthiest way to eat steak don't mean breaking the bank or your belt. Why, it's the kind of cut that'd make a miser smile and a glutton pause. A true friend to any man who loves his meat hearty yet humble. Part 7. The flat iron. A diamond in the rough now. Let's cast our eyes on the flat iron steak. A humble slab also dubbed the boneless top chuck, plucked from the top blade like a pearl from an oyster. For a 100-gram helping, it tips the scales. Add 228 calories, 14 grams of fat, with 5 grams of that saturated scamp, 78 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to muddy the waters, and a solid 25 grams of steak protein content that'd keep a lumberjack swinging. It's a contender among healthy steak cuts. Not too ornery in the toughness department, though it's got a streak of gristle tougher than a river rat's hide. Best carved out afore you cook. Miss Celine Thompson, a wise gal with a master's. Scroll, MSRDN, reckons these cuts are a bargain worth snagging. They're easier on the purse, she says, and if you cook them low and slow, that rich collagen melts out like gold from a vein, giving you flavor without piling on extra fats. It's a fine pick for low-fat steak options, sitting. Pretty in the lean beef cuts ranked for thrift and taste. In a steak calories comparison, it's no featherweight, but the healthiest way to eat steak shines through when you let it simmer gentle-like. Why, it's the kind of cut that proves you don't need a king's ransom or a tub of lard to dine like a lord. Part 8. The flap steak. A flavorful rogue now, let's tip our caps to the flap steak, a scrappy little number that sneaks into the lineup of healthy steak cuts with a grin and a wink. For a 100-gram portion, it clocks in at 196 calories, 13 grams of fat, with 4 grams of that saturated rascal, 49 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to clutter the plate, and a tidy 20 grams of steak protein content that'd keep a sailor. Hearty! Packed with flavor, this lean cut delivers a protein punch without breaking the bank, declares Jessie Holsey, a dietitian from Atlanta, with her RD and LD badges pinned proud. It's a solid contender among low-fat steak options, holding just 18% of your daily saturated fat limit per serving. This ain't no delicate flour. It's got muscle aplenty, but it's leaner than many a rival in the lean beef cuts ranked. Miss Holsey adds, it's a wallet-friendly gem, brimming with iron and B vitamins to boot, essentials for any soul aiming to eat right. In a steak calories comparison, it dances a fine jig. Not too heavy, not too light, making it a prime pick for the healthiest way to eat steak if you've got a taste for thrift and gusto. Why? It's the kind of steak that'd swagger into a saloon, slap a dime on the bar, and still leave you feeling like a king at supper. Part 9. The skirt steak. A tough nut with a big heart. Now, let's mosey over to the skirt steak, a rough and tumble rascal that elbows its way into the roster of healthy steak cuts with grit and gumption. For a 100-gram slab, it tallies 250 calories, 15 grams of fat, with 6 grams of that saturated scoundrel, a hearty 27% of your daily dose, 63 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to weigh it down, and a brawny 29 grams of steak protein content that'd make a prize fighter flex with pride. This cut's got more muscle than many a rival, outpacing them in the protein steaks, while still ranking among the lean beef cuts ranked, though it ain't shy about its 15 grams of fat. Don't expect it to melt in your mouth like some pampered dandy. It's tougher than a riverboat captain's handshake, thanks to that high muscle tally. But that's the trade. More protein, a touch more chew, and a leaner profile than them fat-drenched loafers higher up the scale. In a steak calories comparison, it's no featherweight, but it's a fine pick for the healthiest way to eat steak, if you've got the jaw for it. Among low-fat steak options, it's a scrapper, less greasy than the big boys, yet bold enough to hold its own. Why, it's the kind of steak that'd stare down a grizzly and still leave you grinning over your plate. Part 10. The T-bone and porterhouse. A monarch of meat now. Let's bow to the T-bone, or porterhouse as some call it. A regal cut that struts into the ring of healthy steak cuts with a crown and a scepter, dubbed the king steak by them that know. For a 100-gram slice, it boasts 250 calories, 18 grams of fat, with 7 grams of that saturated tyrant, a hefty 32% of your daily ration, 54 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to spoil the party, and 21 grams of steak protein content fit for a throne. This beast sports a proud T of bone, splitting a New York strip and a filet mignon like a river divides two towns. But here's the rub. A dainty 3-ounce nibble might keep the fat hounds at bay, but a T-bone ain't often caught in such a puny guise. No, sir. It swaggers in at 12 to 18 ounces. The whole kit and caboodle of red meat the wise folks say you oughtn't exceed in a week. In a steak calories comparison, it's a heavyweight champ. Not quite the best lean steak, mind you, but a feast for them that don't flinch at fat. The healthiest way to eat steak here. Share it with a posse, lest you gobble the worst steak for health in one sitting. It's a cut so grand, it'd make a miser weep and a glutton sing. though your waistband might holler for mercy if you don't divvy it up. Part 11. The Delmonico. A tender rogue with a fat pocket now, let's sidle up to the Delmonico steak. Or chuck eye, as some folks tip their hats to it. A cut that sneaks into the lineup of healthy steak cuts with a wink and a waddle. For a 100-gram hunk, call it 3.5 ounces, it rings up 235 calories, 17 grams of fat, with 7 grams of that saturated scamp, clocking 32% of your daily allotment. 60 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to fuss over, and 21 grams of steak protein, content that'd keep a plowman plowing. It's tender as a lover's sigh, but oh, it's got a plump streak of fat that'd make a hog blush. Here's the kicker. That modest 3.5-ounce nibble might sound tame, but a Delmonico don't often play small. No, it rolls out at 10 ounces, or more, piling nigh on 100% of your saturated fat limit in one go. A feast that teeters on the edge of the worst steak for health if you ain't careful. In a steak calories comparison, it's no featherweight, and it's a far cry from the yike. Best lean steak. The healthiest way to eat steak like this? Beg the cook for a sliver, or round up a crew to split it. Else, you'll be waddling out the door with your belt-crying uncle. It's a cut so rich, it'd tempt a saint to sin, but share it, and you might just keep your halo intact. Part 12. The Ribeye, the unhealthiest king of the feast. And now, ladies and gents, we crown the ribeye steak, the undisputed monarch of indulgence and the worst steak for health in our merry lineup. Per 100 grams, about 3.5 ounces, this titan tips the scales at 289 calories, 22 grams of fat, with a walloping 10 grams of saturated sin, nigh on 50% of your daily limit. 361 milligrams of sodium, no carbohydrates to lighten its load, and 24 grams of steak protein content that's almost drowned in its own riches. From the perch of steak nutrition facts, it's a rogue so marbled with fat, it'd make a butter churn jealous. Served up as prime rib when roasted whole, or a tomahawk when slung on the bone. Each bite's a juicy revelry that'd tempt a preacher off his pulpit. Folks chase this cut like hounds after a fox, and no wonder. It's the belle of the ball among lean beef cuts ranked for flavor, not virtue. But here's the gospel. That 100-gram nibble's just a tease. Restaurants will slap a 16-ounce behemoth on your plate, daring you to wrestle it down, while the healthiest way to eat steak whispers, trim it to 3 or 5 ounces, you fool. In a steak calories comparison, it's the heavyweight champ, 2. Grand for the best lean steak title, but a siren song for them that love their meat dripping with decadence. Dodge it? Not wholly, but treat it like a rare spree, lest your heart start groaning louder than your fork scrapes the plate. And there you have it, folks. The grand tally of healthy steak cuts from the noble London broil to the decadent ribeye, laid bare like a gambler's hand at the river's edge. Whether you're chasing the best lean steak to keep your frame, trim, or daring a dance with the worst steak for health just to taste the glory, now you've got the map to navigate this meaty maze. The steak nutrition facts don't lie. Pick your cut wise, cook it right, and you'll feast like a king without losing your crown to the scale. So, what's your next move, you hungry souls? Mosey on over to the grill, try these cuts for size, and let us know you're victor in the comments below. Craving more wisdom to fill your plate? Hit that subscribe button on YouTube, or swing by our blogger patch for more tales of tasty triumphs. Share this with your fellow meat lovers. Let's spread the gospel of good eatin' far and wide.